first of all, he gives a disclaimer that he was no linguist or scientist, but he reckons in his experience that if a rhyme is spelled differently, it has more of an impact, an emotional impact for audience than if they're two words spelled the same.
It's the same. I think it's the same thing Martha was just saying. That
Oh yeah, that's why.
It's the oh yeah experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, can I go back to your example with daddy?
Yes.
So I'm assuming that you would say that the child is going back to the prototype of the sound duck, right?
Yes.
Sort of reverting to the prototype. And then I'm thinking, is the prototype theory somewhat similar to the default phoning theory? And how would it be different from saying that it's sort of reverting to the default?
It's actually, yes, it is very similar. The only difference would be in terms of how you would implement this in some kind of model, actual model, because the default theory would say that in fact what's stored is nothing or just voiced. Whereas I would say what the child is storing is a D, because that's the best kind of alveolar stop. Not something more abstract without that the child knows what is the easiest sound to make and therefore assumes that's what is in that word.
I think he has heard a D there. In that example, I think he's heard dad and dada, dada. Right, I think he inserted D in that position.
When we look at instant-directed speech, quite often there is a reversion to the prototype among the adult, and I suppose then that would be my qualification to that. I don't know about dad. I don't know how often, because I'm thinking now. I don't think I used dad when I spoke to my son as an infant, but maybe I heard it.
Yeah, this may not have been. I mean, one could probably argue that the child has heard a D in that particular word, but there are other cases. It's just it's a sort of classical daddy kind of pronunciation. But yeah, I mean, I think I'll change the example. Opinion.
I've always wondered why when you have a phoneme with two allophones, like the one in English you mentioned, the aspirate versus non-aspirate for the voiceless stops, or in Spanish, the stop and fricative versions of the voice stops. How does a phonologist decide which one is the phoneme? And which factors do you take into account, and does it vary with the different theories that you mentioned? Because, for instance, in the Spanish case, the most common is the fricative, but the stop is the one that is considered to be the phoneme. And I don't know if it's just an arbitrary decision, or if it's the one that is cross-linguistically less marked, or if it has to do with the one that would come out in an out-of-the-blue expression. How do you know which one it is?
Well, I have this 1,000-item bibliography that I would be glad to dump on your desk that deals with just this issue. On
so
which
it is a problem.
It is absolutely a problem. And in fact, there are a number of papers recently talking specifically about Spanish that have argued that the underlying form is the fricative.
Good.
And that the stop is a special contextual version. It's just the spelling system has screwed up linguists' theories here. Just because we know they derive from Latin voiced stops, there's no reason to think they are mentally stored that way. And there's pretty good evidence that they aren't stored as stops, because they only surface as stops on right after nasals and only on some other
Pause, after a pause.
and after a pause, right. I think arguments about prototypicality in the sense of inherently more distinctive and easier to produce, which then you have to get into arguments about physiology and cross-linguistic information. That would be an argument one way or another. There is no simple solution because linguists are still arguing about it.
So for the aspiration in English, the phoneme is supposed to be the unaspirated, right?
I used to think that. I'm coming to believe that it's actually the aspirated one, and that it's deaspiration or deaspiration and flapping and so on in the specific context. And certainly in terms of frequency, the aspirated one is the most common.
Right. But cross-linguistically, which one would be more unmarked?
That turns out to be an ugly question, because it's the data. I mean, it turns out to be almost 50-50. If you look at if you look at all the languages that have aspiration and have without a contrast, because there are languages that have unaspirated and aspirated stops that contrast in addition to voice stops. So if you just look at just languages that have voiceless stops, some of them have them aspirated, and some of them have them unaspirated, and some of them have them in free variation. So there isn't any tidy solution, unfortunately. In European languages, all the voiceless stops in the Romance languages are unaspirated. In the Germanic languages, about half of them are aspirated. So they're not in Dutch, they are in German and English. They are in Scandinavian languages. Steve?
I'm not sure whether this is a brickbat or a bouquet, but obviously I'm broadly in sympathy with your prototype theories that you presented elsewhere. My question really is with your working assumption that perception is veridical, because I think what you've actually provided us here with is evidence that perception, what phonemes are in fact somewhat culturally specific, somewhat physiologically constrained system of auditory illusions, rather, that is to say that since what we produce and what we is not the same as what we hear, that in fact there is some degree to which perception must correspond to reality. But the extent to which that's true, I think, is still quite an open question. I'm reminded here, speaking from my own discipline, of the anthropologist V. Gordon Childe, who argued in the 1950s that we adapt to the world not as it is, but as we perceive it to be. He then qualified that to say that if the world were not somewhat to the way in which we perceive it, that evolution would have wiped us out very rapidly. And I presume that's the sort of argument you were making initially.
That's correct.
And I think that's quite true. But then what we really seem to be discussing here is to what degree does this have to be the case? And that seems to be maybe and I'm not sure. Maybe I'm just being overly tendentious and obstreperous here, but.
We should all have obstreperous colleagues like you. No, I think clearly what I was arguing against was the idea that perception was in some sense arbitrary. It has to at least be sufficiently shared so that when someone talks, we perceive what they're doing as what we would be doing with our own mouths, because our mouths work the same or are built the same, speaking metaphorically or of course. But yeah, I like your characterization of it. It's a shared illusion, but not unconstrained.
In that sense, is it at all? I don't know if you're familiar with the carpentered world hypothesis.
I've seen the phrase in the last 2 months, in the last 2 weeks, but I don't remember.
This is the idea, for instance, that the famous Muller-Lyer illusion of the two lines, with one of which has the arrows pointing inwards and one of which has the arrows pointing outwards, is in part constrained by the fact that people who live in carpentered worlds, that is, worlds where they're exposed to lots of right angles, are more subject to this illusion because of what happens when you look at the corner of a room and you see the lines, the diagonal lines, as I'm looking now at a curved wall.
This is a lousy
and then that would suggest that to some degree there could be an auditory effect similar to this. Some of these unusual cases that you're talking about here might be that sort of thing. I don't know. I need to think about this more.
Okay, so clearly, so do I. So I will. However, on the other hand, I do have, unfortunately, someplace else I need to go.